Elena Volkov pressed her eye against the scope, her breath steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The abandoned factory rooftop provided the perfect vantage point over the contested valley below. At 19, she had already earned a reputation that made hardened soldiers whisper her name with equal parts fear and admiration. The war had taken everything from her: her village, her family, her childhood, all reduced to ash and memory 3 years ago when enemy forces swept through like a plague. But from that devastation, something fierce had been born. Elena had discovered she possessed a gift that would become her weapon of vengeance, an almost supernatural ability with a rifle that defied explanation. Her fingers moved with practiced precision as she adjusted the scope. 200 meters below, enemy troops were advancing through the tree line, unaware of the angel of death watching from above. Elena's commanding officer, Captain Petrov, had given her explicit orders: eliminate the enemy reconnaissance team before they could report back on the defensive positions. She had been operating behind enemy lines for 6 months now, part of an elite unit that specialized in impossible missions. Her kill count had reached triple digits, each shot a small payment toward the debt she felt the world owed her. But today felt different. Something in the air whispered of change, of an ending approaching. The first target appeared in her crosshairs, a young soldier, probably not much older than herself. For a brief moment, Elena hesitated. She could see his face clearly, the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he gripped his weapon. Then she remembered her little brother's face in the burning wreckage of their home, and her finger found the trigger. The shot was perfect, as always. The soldier dropped silently, and his companions scattered, searching for the source of death that had found them. Elena shifted position slightly, already lining up her second shot. This was her ritual, her purpose, her reason for continuing to breathe. But as she prepared to fire again, a glint of sunlight caught her attention. On the opposite ridge, nearly 800 meters away, another scope was reflecting the morning light. Elena's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. She was not the only sniper on this battlefield. Someone else was hunting, and they had just spotted her. The enemy sniper was good. Very good. Elena could tell by the way they had positioned themselves, using the natural camouflage of the rocky outcropping to remain nearly invisible. This was no ordinary soldier, but a professional killer like herself. She estimated she had perhaps 30 seconds before the other shooter would have a clear shot at her position. Elena made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. Instead of retreating, instead of calling for backup, she chose to engage. Pride, perhaps, or the arrogance of youth, convinced her that she was the superior marksman. She had never missed a shot that mattered, never failed to eliminate her target. Today would be no different. She swung her rifle toward the enemy position, calculating wind speed and bullet drop in her mind. The distance was extreme, even for someone of her skill level. At 800 meters, 1,000 variables could throw off her shot by inches, and inches meant the difference between life and death. Through her scope, she caught a glimpse of her opponent, another young woman, dark-haired, with the same cold determination in her eyes that Elena saw in mirrors. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the two snipers stared at each other across the battlefield, each recognizing a kindred spirit in the other. Elena fired first. The bullet screamed across the valley, but at the last second, the enemy sniper had shifted position. The shot missed by centimeters, striking the rock where her target's head had been moments before. Elena cursed under her breath and worked the bolt action, chambering another round. But she was too late. The return shot came like thunder, and Elena felt the impact before she heard the sound. The bullet struck her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her rifle clattering across the rooftop. Pain exploded through her body, but she forced herself to move, to find cover behind the concrete ledge. Blood was flowing freely from the wound, and Elena could feel her strength ebbing. She tried to reach for her sidearm, but her right arm wouldn't respond properly. The bullet had done more damage than she initially realized, possibly nicking an artery. She pressed her left hand against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. From below, she could hear voices. Enemy soldiers had triangulated her position from the muzzle flash and were now climbing toward her hiding spot. Elena tried to call for extraction on her radio, but the device had been damaged in the fall. She was alone, wounded, and rapidly running out of options. The factory was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed walkways. Elena forced herself to move, leaving a trail of blood drops as she searched for a way down. Her vision was starting to blur from blood loss, but she kept pushing forward, driven by pure survival instinct. She found a service ladder leading to the lower levels and began her descent. Halfway down, her strength finally gave out, and she fell the remaining 15 feet to the concrete floor below. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent fresh waves of agony through her wounded shoulder. Elena crawled behind a massive piece of industrial equipment, pressing herself into the deepest shadows she could find. She could hear boots on the metal stairs above. Her pursuers were close. With her good hand, she pulled out her combat knife. Knowing it would be useless against multiple armed soldiers, but finding comfort in its familiar weight. The enemy soldiers swept through the factory floor systematically, checking every hiding spot, every shadow. Elena held her breath as they passed within inches of her position. One soldier paused directly in front of her hiding spot, and she prepared to sell her life dearly. But then came the sound of explosions from outside. Her unit had arrived and was engaging the enemy forces. The soldiers searching for her were called back to defend their position. Elena listened as their footsteps retreated, leaving her alone in the darkness. She knew she was dying. The blood loss was severe, and without medical attention, she would be dead within hours. But at least she would die free, not as a prisoner. Elena closed her eyes and thought of her family, of her village, of all the people she had failed to save. As consciousness began to slip away, she heard new voices, friendlier voices speaking in her own language. Her unit had found her. She felt hands lifting her, heard Captain Petrov shouting for a medic. But it was too late. The darkness was claiming her, pulling her down into what felt like a bottomless well. The last thing Elena remembered was the sound of gunfire fading into the distance and the sensation of floating, as if she were already becoming a ghost. She had given everything to the war, and now the war was taking her life as payment. It seemed fitting, somehow, that her story would end here, in this forgotten factory, surrounded by the tools of industry that had been twisted into instruments of death. But death, it seemed, was not quite ready for Elena Volkov. As the medics worked frantically to save her life, transporting her to a field hospital where surgeons would fight their own battle against time and trauma, Elena's story was far from over. The girl who had lived for vengeance was about to learn that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to die. Elena's eyes opened to the sterile white ceiling of a military hospital, though it took several moments for her vision to focus properly. The beeping of medical equipment filled her ears, and she could feel the weight of bandages across her shoulder and chest. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her body like lightning. "Easy there, soldier," a gentle voice spoke from beside her bed. Elena turned her head slowly to see a middle-aged nurse checking her IV drip. "You've been unconscious for 3 weeks. We weren't sure you were going to make it." 3 weeks. Elena's mind struggled to process this information. The last clear memory she had was of bleeding out on the factory floor, certain she was going to die. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw and dry. The nurse quickly brought her a cup of water. "What happened to my unit?" Elena managed to croak after taking a few careful sips. The nurse's expression darkened slightly. "I'll let the doctor explain everything. He's been waiting for you to wake up." She pressed a call button, and within minutes, a tired-looking man in a white coat entered the room. Dr. Kozlov had been treating wounded soldiers for over a decade, but Elena's case had been unlike anything he'd seen before. The bullet had shattered her shoulder blade, nicked a major artery, and caused massive tissue damage. She had lost nearly half her blood volume by the time she reached the operating table. "Miss Volkov, I'm Dr. Kozlov. You're very lucky to be alive." He pulled up a chair beside her bed. "The bullet did significant damage to your right shoulder. We were able to save the arm, but you'll never have full mobility again. Your shooting days are over." The words hit Elena harder than any bullet could have. Shooting wasn't just what she did. It was who she was. Without her rifle, without her deadly precision, she was just another casualty of war. She stared at the ceiling, feeling emptiness wash over her that was worse than any physical pain. "There's something else," Dr. Kozlov continued gently. "Your unit. They were overrun 2 days after you were wounded. Captain Petrov and most of your team didn't make it out. I'm sorry." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the last connections to her old life snap like overstretched cables. Everyone was gone. Her family, her village, her unit, all consumed by the endless hunger of war. She was alone in a way that few people could understand, a living ghost haunting the edges of a conflict that had already moved beyond her. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Elena's life. Physical therapy was a daily torture, forcing her damaged shoulder to move in ways that sent agony shooting down her arm. The therapists were optimistic about her progress, but Elena could feel the difference. Her right hand shook when she tried to hold objects, and the fine motor control she had once possessed was gone forever. She tried holding a rifle during one therapy session, just to see if there was any hope of returning to her role as a sniper. The weapon felt foreign in her hands, impossibly heavy. When she attempted to aim at a practice target, her hands trembled so badly that she couldn't even see through the scope properly. Elena set the rifle down and didn't touch another one for months. But something unexpected happened during those long weeks of recovery. As Elena learned to live with her disability, she also began to understand warfare from a completely different perspective. She spent hours reading military tactical manuals, studying strategy and logistics, learning about the broader picture that she had never seen while focused through a rifle scope. The hospital treated soldiers from many different units, and Elena began talking to other wounded warriors. She learned about communication systems, explosives, psychological warfare, and dozens of other specialties she had never considered before. Each conversation was like adding another piece to a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. One particular conversation changed everything. A demolitions expert named Sergeant Dmitri had lost his left leg to a landmine, but was adapting remarkably well to his prosthetic. He was telling Elena about improvised explosive devices when something clicked in her mind. "You know," Dmitri said one afternoon as they sat in the hospital garden, "the war has changed since you've been here. Both sides are using more technology now: drones, electronic surveillance, cyber warfare. The days of lone wolf snipers might be ending." Elena absorbed this information with growing interest. If traditional sniping was becoming obsolete, perhaps there were other ways to strike at the enemy, other ways to continue her war of vengeance. She began requesting books on modern warfare technology, studying everything from computer systems to drone operations. The more she learned, the more a new plan began to form in her mind. Elena Volkov, the sniper, might be dead, but someone else could take her place. Someone who understood the enemy's weaknesses in ways that went far beyond marksmanship. After 6 months in the hospital, Elena was discharged with a medical pension and a recommendation for civilian life. Instead, she used her back pay and pension to disappear. She moved to a neutral city on the border, where she spent another year learning skills that had nothing to do with traditional warfare. She studied electronics, learning to build and dismantle complex devices. She practiced with computers until she could hack into basic military systems. Most importantly, she learned patience. Not the quick, deadly patience of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot, but the long-term patience of someone planning a campaign. Elena also discovered that her reputation had grown during her absence. Stories of her exploits had spread through both armies, becoming the stuff of legend. Some claimed she had killed over 200 enemy soldiers before her apparent death. Others whispered that she had been a ghost all along, a spirit of vengeance that couldn't be killed because she was already dead. The enemy forces had even created a special unit dedicated to hunting down snipers like the legendary Elena Volkov. They had developed new tactics, new equipment, new protocols, all designed to counter a threat they believed was eliminated. They had prepared for the return of a sniper, not suspecting that the woman they feared was evolving into something far more dangerous. During her year of preparation, Elena carefully gathered intelligence about the current state of the war. The front lines had shifted dramatically during her absence, and both sides had adapted new technologies and strategies. But she also identified weaknesses: communication hubs, supply routes, command structures that could be disrupted by someone with the right knowledge and motivation. As winter approached, Elena began planning her return to the war. But this time, she wouldn't be going back as a sniper. This time, she would be something the enemy had never faced before: a strategist with intimate knowledge of combat, a ghost who understood that the most devastating attacks often came from directions no one was watching. Elena stood at the window of her small apartment, looking out at the snow-covered city below. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the war continued without her. Soldiers were dying, villages were burning, families were being destroyed, all while she had been learning to become something new. Her reflection in the window showed a young woman who looked older than her 21 years. The eager girl who had first picked up a rifle seeking simple vengeance was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true victory required more than just accurate shooting. Elena smiled grimly at her reflection, flexing her damaged right hand. The enemy thought Elena Volkov was dead, and in a way, they were right. The sniper they feared was gone forever, but what was coming to replace her would be far worse than anything they had prepared for. Elena began gathering the equipment she would need for her return, not rifles and ammunition this time, but tools for a completely different kind of warfare. The war had taken everything from her and had tried to take her life as well. Now it was time to collect on the debt that was owed. Elena Volkov was ready to return to the battlefield, and this time she wouldn't just be aiming at individual soldiers. This time, she would be targeting the war itself. The enemy command center buzzed with activity as Colonel Morrison studied the intelligence reports spread across his desk. For 18 months, their forces had been systematically dismantled by an unknown adversary who struck without warning and vanished like smoke. Communication towers exploded at precisely the worst moments, supply convoys disappeared on supposedly secure routes, and their most classified operations were somehow being anticipated and countered. "Sir, we've lost another ammunition depot," reported Lieutenant Hayes, his voice tight with frustration. "Third one this month. Same pattern. No witnesses, no direct confrontation, just complete destruction of our supplies." Morrison rubbed his tired eyes. His superiors were demanding answers he didn't have. The mysterious saboteur had cost them more equipment and strategic advantage than any single enemy unit in the history of the conflict. Some of his men were beginning to whisper about ghosts and supernatural forces. What Morrison didn't know was that Elena Volkov was watching his command center from a drainage tunnel 300 meters away, her laptop connected to a network tap she had installed weeks earlier. She could read every message, monitor every conversation, and anticipate every move his forces made. The girl who had once hunted individual soldiers was now hunting entire military operations. Elena's methods had evolved far beyond anything her former commanders could have imagined. Instead of eliminating soldiers one by one, she targeted the systems that supported them. A carefully placed charge could disable communications for an entire battalion. A hacked supply order could redirect critical medical supplies to the wrong coordinates. A single line of sabotaged code could crash targeting systems at the exact moment they were needed most. Her first major operation after returning to the war zone had been a masterpiece of misdirection. Elena had spent 2 months infiltrating the enemy's communication network, learning their protocols and identifying key vulnerabilities. Then, during a major offensive, she had systematically shut down their coordination systems while feeding false information to field commanders. The result had been chaos on a scale that no conventional weapon could have achieved. Enemy units had fired on their own forces, supply drops had been made to empty fields, and reinforcements had been sent to defend positions that were never actually under attack. An entire division had been rendered combat ineffective without Elena firing a single shot. But tonight's operation would be different. Tonight she was going after the command structure itself. Elena had discovered that Colonel Morrison's headquarters contained the central server for the entire sector's military network. If she could access that server physically, she could download intelligence that would allow her forces to predict enemy movements for months in advance. Elena checked her equipment one final time. Gone were the days of carrying just a rifle and ammunition. Her backpack now contained electronic devices, explosive charges, signal jammers, and a dozen other tools that most soldiers wouldn't even recognize. She had become a one-person special operations unit, capable of accomplishing missions that would normally require an entire squad. Moving through the darkness, Elena approached the enemy compound with skills that combined her old training with new techniques. She avoided the patrol routes not by hiding from guards, but by accessing their communication system and tracking their movements in real time through her modified tablet. Every sentry's position was marked on her screen like pieces on a chessboard. The compound security system was impressive by conventional standards, but Elena had been studying it for weeks through hacked surveillance feeds. She knew which sensors had blind spots, which alarms were connected to backup power, and which doors used electronic locks that could be defeated with the right tools. Reaching the main building undetected, Elena attached a small device to the communication cable running along the building's exterior wall. Within seconds, she had access to the internal network and could monitor the location of every person inside the structure. The server room was in the basement, guarded by 2 sentries who believed they were protecting against conventional infiltration. Elena smiled grimly as she began implementing a plan that would have been impossible during her days as a sniper. Instead of trying to eliminate the guards quietly, she triggered a false alarm in a completely different part of the building. The guards immediately abandoned their posts to investigate, leaving the server room temporarily undefended. Moving swiftly through corridors that she had memorized from stolen blueprints, Elena reached her target within minutes. The server room contained enough intelligence to shift the entire balance of the war. As her equipment began copying terabytes of classified information, Elena planted small charges throughout the facility, not to kill, but to destroy the enemy's ability to coordinate their forces. While the download completed, Elena accessed the enemy's communication system one final time. She began sending contradictory orders to field units, creating confusion and forcing commanders to question the reliability of their own command structure. By the time anyone realized what was happening, their entire operational capability would be compromised. The copying finished just as Elena heard footsteps in the hallway above. The guards had discovered that the earlier alarm was false and were returning to their posts. Elena activated the charges on a delayed timer, giving herself exactly 4 minutes to escape before the building's communication hub would be reduced to scrap metal. But as she prepared to leave, Elena heard something that made her blood run cold, a familiar voice on the radio frequency she was monitoring. The enemy sniper who had wounded her 18 months ago was somewhere in the area, apparently part of the security team for this facility. For a moment, Elena felt the old hunger for personal revenge flare up inside her. The woman who had nearly killed her was just a few hundred meters away, probably unaware that her former target was even alive. Elena could track her down, could finally settle the score between them. Instead, Elena chose to complete her mission. The personal vendetta that had once driven her entire existence seemed small compared to the larger victory she was about to achieve. She had learned that true victory wasn't about killing individual enemies. It was about making it impossible for them to fight effectively. Elena escaped from the compound just as the charges detonated, destroying millions of dollars worth of communication equipment and months of carefully gathered intelligence. But more importantly, she had proven that the age of conventional warfare was ending. A single person with the right knowledge and tools could accomplish more than entire armies using traditional methods. The impact of Elena's operation rippled across the battlefield over the following weeks. Enemy forces found themselves unable to coordinate large-scale attacks, their supply lines disrupted, their intelligence networks compromised. Commanders who had once moved with confidence now second-guessed every decision, wondering if their communications were being monitored or their plans being anticipated. Colonel Morrison was eventually relieved of command, his superiors having lost confidence in his ability to counter the mysterious saboteur. His replacement, Colonel Chen, arrived with new protocols and advanced security measures, but even she struggled to adapt to an enemy who seemed to understand their systems better than they did themselves. Meanwhile, Elena continued her campaign from the shadows. She had become something unprecedented in military history, a strategic disruptor who could single-handedly destabilize entire military operations. Her methods were studied and copied by special forces units on both sides of the conflict, revolutionizing the way modern warfare was conducted. But perhaps the most significant change was in Elena herself. The angry, vengeful girl who had picked up a rifle seeking simple revenge had evolved into something far more sophisticated. She had learned that the greatest victories came not from destroying enemies, but from making their destruction unnecessary. 6 months after her return, Elena received an encrypted message from High Command offering her a position training the next generation of warfare specialists. They wanted to study her methods, to understand how one person had accomplished what entire military units had failed to achieve. Elena considered the offer while standing on a hilltop overlooking the valley where her old unit had made their last stand. In the distance, she could see the abandoned factory where she had almost died, now just another ruin in a landscape scarred by years of conflict. She realized that her war was finally over, not because the larger conflict had ended, but because she had found a way to fight that didn't require her to sacrifice her humanity in the process. The girl who had lived for vengeance had discovered something more powerful, the ability to protect others by making violence impossible rather than inevitable. Elena typed her response to High Command, accepting their offer but with conditions. She would train others, but she would also work to develop new rules of engagement that prioritized protecting civilians over achieving military objectives. The skills she had developed could be used to save lives rather than taking them. As she walked away from the hilltop, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The war that had taken everything from her had also taught her that even the most devastating conflicts could be ended by people who were willing to think differently about what victory actually meant. Behind her, the sun set over a battlefield that would never again be shattered by the return of Elena Volkov, because Elena Volkov had finally found a way to wage peace instead of war.